everybody, I'm Luna. Welcome back to Luna ơi! Over the past few months, the world has been watching as the USA has completely unmasked itself as the international bully it has always been. With Trump as president and figures like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, and many other billionaires lining up behind a fascistic coup, it's more clear than ever that the USA is a rogue state ruled by an authoritarian oligarchy of capitalists. Now these oligarchs are tightening their grip and cementing their power, doing everything they can to enrich themselves without any concern for what happens to the workers in the USA and around the world. This video is a message to those of us who, like myself, live outside the USA, and I would specifically like to address those of you in Europe. Right now, a lot of you in Europe are shocked and deeply concerned. A lot of you feel abandoned and betrayed by what you believed to be a strong ally. For me, that betrayal was no surprise. You see, I am Vietnamese, and we here in Vietnam know full well that the USA's bourgeois government is capable of doing in the name of capitalistic greed. As you surely know, Vietnam fought and won a revolution against a brutal occupation perpetrated by the US about 50 years ago. My parents still carry vivid memories of that dark chapter in history. Vietnamese people saw firsthand the war crimes committed by US troops. Most Vietnamese people understand the true nature of the US, its brutality, deceit, and cruelty. Yet many of my friends abroad, particularly in Europe, still don't see the US for what it truly is. Perhaps that is until now. In recent years, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic first broke out, the whole world has watched Europe struggle. Its society shaken and its economy becoming precarious and unstable. Then came the war in Ukraine. Here in Vietnam, we felt like we were watching history repeat itself. The US pledged to support Ukraine to the end of its war against Russia, only to betray the Ukrainians as soon as a faction of capitalists saw the opportunity to further their own ends by abandoning Ukraine altogether. For us, the current situation in Ukraine and across Europe is no surprise. We have seen this playbook before. The tactics used by the US are deeply insidious. Henry Kissinger was one of the worst human beings who ever lived, but he was right about one thing. It may be dangerous to be America's enemy, but to be America's friend is fatal. Sorry, I just feel a little bit dirty myself. I couldn't believe that one day I would unironically quoted Henry Kissinger. Anyway, to understand what the USA is doing to Ukraine, first take a look at the Lend-Lease Act, signed by President Franklin Roosevelt in 1941. This act provided millions of dollars worth of military equipment, supplies, and weapons to allied nations for their war efforts. At a time when European nations were desperate in their fight against fascist Germany and Italy, the US stepped in with their geopolitical power to manipulate the situation. Safely isolated on its own continent, far from the devastation of war, the US emerged unscathed and wealthy, with ample resources to lure Europe into its carefully laid trap. Through the Lend-Lease Act, Europe unwittingly opened its door to US imperialism, allowing the exploitation of its labor and natural resources. Now, I know that a lot of Americans and even Europeans have been indoctrinated to believe that the Lend-Lease Act after World War II was a selfless act of generosity. On the surface, yes, this Lend-Lease Act looks like the US was just offering support to Europe, and the USA propaganda certainly wants you to believe that this was a magnanimous act of solidarity with allies. But the truth is, the United States never helps anyone without squeezing out every drop of payback from whoever they assist. As American historian George Herring Jr. said in the introduction of his book, Aid to Russia in 1941 to 1946, the Lend-Lease Act was not the most altruistic act in human history, but rather a calculated act of selfishness, and the Americans were always clear about the benefits they could gain from this program. The Lend-Lease Act made European countries dependent on US products that would benefit them in the long term, and as a matter of fact, European nations still depend on the US in many ways to this very day as a result of the Lend-Lease Act. At the same time, the US greatly benefited from Lend-Lease since it played a vital role in ending the Great Depression of the US and brought it to an era of economic bloom when the US became the biggest weapon exporter in the world. The US played a clever hand. Instead of demanding immediate repayment, the nations of Europe will gradually turn into the puppets and pawns of American imperialist interests and the anti-communist agenda of America's Cold War. Economically, European nations became dependent on U.S. products. Politically, they act as America's lapdogs, ready to follow U.S. commands, always following the lead of the USA and becoming overtly reliant on the American military. Nowadays, NATO nations pay billions of dollars every year for U.S. weapons. European nations' dependence on the United States has only grown deeper since the collapse of the Soviet Union. NATO stands as the clearest example of U.S. imperialism, a direct consequence of the Lend-Lease Act. As I mentioned above, Lend-Lease Act was introduced and signed by the U.S. and allied nations during World War II. Right after World War II ended, the U.S. introduced a new program called the Marshall Plan. If the Lend-Lease Act could be considered as military aid program, the Marshall Plan could be understood as the successor of the previous act with the purpose of giving economic aid to Europe to help rebuild the continent after the war and to stop the spread of communism. The U.S. was very afraid that the new communist bloc would threaten the power of the U.S., especially in Europe, where the U.S. had invested heavily. The spread of communism was a huge risk to that investment. For all these reasons, the US and its Western European allies formed a military organization called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949. So American influence went through the three main phases in the war and post-war period, from the Lend-Lease Act to the Marshall Plan to the founding of NATO. From the very beginning, NATO served as an ultimate tool for the US to put Europe under its control, spreading its influence and indoctrinating its citizens into American ideologies, while forcing European nations to expand their own resources to combat communism since World War II. NATO also serves as a means to threaten nations that dare to resist US dominance. And the USA manages to enforce this agenda, putting European soldiers in harm's way to protect an American geopolitical agenda. So you see, the US leverages European lives and resources to expand its power, just as it uses Ukrainian lives to fight against Russia. Now you can see how readily the USA has abandoned Ukraine entirely as soon as a wealthy capitalist oligarch believes he can get better benefit from switching over to Russia's side. The only loyalty the American capitalist ruling class has is to their own wealth and power. In Vietnam, when the Ukraine-Russia war began, Vietnamese communists often said, the US will fight Russia till the last Ukrainian. It is a grim joke, but one that reveals a harsh truth about the US nature. They will sacrifice your life to fight against their enemies because to them, you are expendable. How do we know that? Because it's exactly what they did to the Republic of Vietnam, the puppet government that occupied the South during the America's imperialist invasion of my country. The United States started out pretending to befriend the Southern fascist regime. They helped install a brutal dictator who executed anyone suspected of being communist. I have covered many of these atrocities in detail in many other videos. Check the links in the description if you want to dive deeper into this dark chapter of our history. At first, the USA provided direct military support to Southern puppet government. They even roped other countries like Australia and South Korea into sending soldiers over to fight and die in the war. But after the Tet Offensive, when the US military suffered huge losses to Vietnamese communist forces, the war became very unpopular in the USA. The Americans had blessed to total support to the Republic of Vietnam puppet government, but as soon as push came to shove, the Americans abandoned them, withdrawing support more and more year after year until the puppet government was utterly defeated, betrayed and abandoned by their supposed American allies. But the story does not end there. After the fascist puppet regime in South Vietnam fell to our communist forces, abandoned and betrayed by their would-be allies, what do you think the USA did next? For starters, the USA pressured the rest of the United Nations to put comprehensive sanctions on Vietnam for over 30 years. Next, they forced the new communist government of Vietnam to repay the debt of that very fascist puppet regime that they had funded to oppress us. Let that sink in. The US installed a brutal fascist dictator, and when that fascist regime was overthrown by our communist fighters defending our homeland, they demanded that the new government pay back the debt of their own puppets. The amount was $145 million, equivalent to $840 million today. Vietnam finally paid off this unjust debt in 2019, just 6 years ago. And remember that when Vietnam was first saddled with that debt, we were the poorest country on earth. Vietnam endured over 100 years of war, first against colonialist France, and over a decade of relentless carpet bombing and all kinds of atrocities by the US. By the end of it, we were a dirt poor nation. Yet, against all odds, we defeated the superpower USA. But right after our unthinkable victory, the US wields its immense power to force us to repay a debt that we never even owed, while simultaneously imposing sanctions on us as a punishment. This, of course, is only one example of the USA promising to support a nation only to abandon and betray them in the long run. One of America's most common tactics is to push other nations into precarious situations, then abandon them when it no longer serves their interests. Take, for example, what happened to France in 2021. France, supposedly a close and long-time US ally, suffered a $65 billion loss due to the AUKUS deal between Australia and the US. And the French government openly declared it had been betrayed by both nations. This was a major wake-up call for NATO countries, exposing the harsh reality that for the US, profit comes first. Friendship and long-term alliances means little if they stand in the way of making more money for American capitalists. I translated this book. I worked on this for 3 years. This book is on the Vietnamese curriculum of Marxism-Leninism. And this is part 1, dialectical materialism. Part 2, historical materialism, will be out very soon. You can get the ebook for free at banyanhouse.org, or you can order a hard copy to support us. Now back to the video. Here's another example. Right now, there are 15 major US military bases scattered across Japan. In 2022, Japan had to pay the US over $9 billion to cover the cost of hosting US troops for 5 years. That's nearly $2 billion annually for approximately 54,000 US military personnel. In 2023, there were 118 crimes linked to US military personnel stationed in Japan, roughly one case every 3 days. Many of these crimes were sexual assaults, highlighting the severe consequences of allowing a United States military presence into your country. The situation in South Korea is even worse. With at least 9 US military bases on its soil, South Korea pays over $1 billion annually to the US for this presence. In 2022, there were 521 crimes tied to US military personnel. And in 2023, the number rose to 599 cases. That's nearly 2 crimes every single day committed by US personnel in South Korea. And let me tell you, South Korean people are not happy about this. So what's the takeaway? When you submit to US power and embrace its imperialism, it drains your resources like a leech while terrorizing your people. Yet, the US spent millions of dollars on propaganda, painting itself as a protector and savior of your nation, ensuring you remain a willing victim of its exploitation. But what happens to countries that resist US imperialism? Well, the USSR did not submit to American imperialism. So in 1972, the USA forced the Soviet Union to hand over $722 million as repayment to the USA for military support in World War II. Never mind the millions of Soviet soldiers who gave their lives to help the Americans win the war and all the other contributions made by the USSR. For the USA, it was all transactional. And if the Soviets were not going to let the USA imperialize them, then they would have to pay up. Adjusted for inflation, the USSR had to pay over $5.4 billion, a staggering sum for a nation that had lost 20 million people in the fight against fascism, a fight that ultimately saved the world, including the USA itself. I could go on and on. I could probably talk for hours about all the ways the USA has betrayed and abandoned its supposed friends and committed crimes against the populations of small, poor nations. Afghanistan, Indonesia, Chile, Palestine, and the list goes on and on. So many nations have suffered in the name of power and profits for the USA's ruling class. Now, with all this in mind, let's revisit the situation between the Ukraine and the US. After years of funding Ukraine, the US is now demanding repayment, $500 billion, to be paid in rare earth minerals, oil, and other natural resources. It is surprising to you? To us Vietnamese, it's exactly what we expected from the very beginning. I personally read through the US-Ukraine deal in full. There's a link to the entire document in the description so you can see it for yourself. And let me tell you, this proposed deal is not what the capitalist media is portraying it to be. What the media tells you is that the US demanded Ukraine to pay back $500 billion. But this doesn't mean Ukraine will pay the US in cash and that cash will go directly to the US government as public funds. In reality, and any Americans watching this should understand this, the people and government of the USA will receive nothing. Not a single dime will go to their healthcare funds or education or public expenses or anything that will serve the American people. Instead, the US wants to sign a reconstruction deal with Ukraine. With this deal, whenever Ukraine mines and sells any kinds of minerals, not just rare earth or oil or metal, but any minerals, the vast majority of the money that Ukraine makes will go to an account like a reconstruction fund. And those funds will go to American capitalists, not the government, and not the people of the USA. To put it simply, the Ukraine will sell its minerals, and the proceeds from that money will go into a reconstruction fund. The reconstruction fund will be used to rebuild Ukraine, and the companies that do that reconstruction and receive those funds will be chosen by the US government. Basically, this means that the money will be given to Donald Trump, who will then have the complete authority to decide which of his capitalist friends get to receive the funds. I hope by now you can see how dangerous it is if Ukraine agrees with this, and that this entire deal is to benefit the American capitalist class, not the American working class. This deal creates perfect conditions for the rich capitalists to benefit from the devastation of Ukraine. It opens a huge door for capitalists to hold even more wealth of Ukraine into their pockets. Corruption will rampant, while both the US and Ukraine workers will suffer. Just think about how corrupt this entire war in Ukraine has been, how much it has benefited American capitalists. First, American military-industrial corporations received billions of dollars to manufacture weapons, and they got all that money from American taxpayers. Now, to repay that money, which was taken from American taxpayers to buy weapons, generations of Ukrainians will have to pay a massive amount of money to American corporations for reconstruction. It only makes sense when you see that the entire reason the United States government exists is to benefit the American ruling class. This is exactly what we Vietnamese communists knew would happen from day one. It is not cynicism that made us predict that this would happen. It's our knowledge of history and our knowledge of the capitalist imperialist system that rules the USA. Vietnam ranks second in the world for rare earth mineral reserves, but so far, we have refrained from exploiting these extremely valuable resources. Why? Because mining these resources would require high levels of technology that big foreign corporations restrict us from using. Without the proper technology, it would be catastrophic for our environment to mine those incredibly valuable rare earth minerals. Vietnam could become rich overnight if we chose to exploit those natural resources, especially with China, the top holder of these resources, standing as the biggest rival of the USA. If Vietnam wanted to invite American companies in to mine those minerals, believe me, the USA would make it happen in an instant. But Vietnam continues to refuse such an arrangement, both because we don't want to give imperialists that kind of access, and because we don't want our environment to be completely destroyed by destructive mining processes. I tell you all this because right now, I'm deeply concerned for Ukraine's ecological and geopolitical future. The United States demanding Ukraine to pay over $500 billion in rare earth minerals put Ukraine in an incredibly bad position, because not only does it give American capitalists an absurd amount of power over the Ukrainian political economy, but it could also spell disaster for Ukraine's natural environment. Despite the glowing image Western propaganda paints of the US, the ugly truth is, the imperialist USA will never give up anything for free. If you don't pay back in cash, you will pay back with your people's lives, your environment, or the well-being of your future generations. And let me be clear, it is not only Ukraine that's suffering. The entire European continent will also now being destabilized by the US. Ukraine is just one glaring example unfolding right in front of your eyes. To be clear, I'm not saying that Russia is not responsible for its part in invading Ukraine, but if you can't see now that the USA was stringing Ukraine along and pretending to be a friend, provoking Ukraine towards war with Russia, and hoping to ultimately profit from whatever the outcome might happen to be, then you are either naive or simply far too indoctrinated by American propaganda to see things clearly. Now, since it seems as if Ukraine has been unable to win the war, the US will switch sides over to the victors. And at the same time, it is using all the tools at its disposal to force repayment of debt that would take Ukraine 250 years to settle. And through Ukraine, the US has shaken all of Europe, leaving the continent to deal with the consequences of America's reckless foreign policies. Of course, this entire situation is very chaotic, and that's because fascists and capitalists thrive on chaos and confusion. By the time this video comes out, it's entirely possible that the US could switch sides again and start publicly favoring Ukraine. Who knows? The USA is completely unreliable and untrustworthy and unpredictable. And that is the point. Capitalists are opportunists first and foremost. The only thing we can know for sure is that they will always do whatever they think will bring them the most wealth and power. The US doesn't give a damn about Ukrainian workers. They don't give a damn about European people, just like they don't give a damn about the Japanese, South Koreans, and Vietnamese who've been suffering under their greed and violence. All they care about is how much wealth they can extract from us. I don't know how much more obvious it needs to become before you can finally open your eyes and see the true nature of the US. It's time for you, my friends outside of the USA, to make a decision. The world is at the crossroads right now, especially Europe. Since the end of World War II, Europe has followed the lead of the USA, and look at where it's gotten you. The same can be said for most of the rest of the world. It is clear now that the United States has misdirected, misinformed, and mistreated the world for far too long. Even if you see now that following the lead of the USA is dangerous, there's something else you need to understand. It's not enough to simply stop bowing to the USA. One thing that worries me is the possibility that European nations will stop following the USA's lead, but continue emulating the USA's behavior to try to outbully the bullies, to emulate the American strategy of duplicity and plunder. Do you want to follow the imperialist path, becoming another bully that exploits other poorer countries in Asia, Africa, and South America? Or do you want to stand up on your own feet and build genuine friendships with the rest of the world? Remember, world politics is not a zero-sum game. No one has to lose for you to win. That is a lie that has been fed to you by American propagandists in order to keep you subservient. In this world, true win-win friendships are possible, where nations benefit mutually without exploiting each other. Take Vietnam and Laos for example. In the wartime, Laos sacrificed countless lives to help us fight against colonialist France and later the imperialist USA. When Vietnam was comprehensively sanctioned by the US and the rest of the world, Laos was one of the very few countries that was willing to trade with us, risking their own country's stability. And recently, we provided Laos with one of our deep-sea ports, enabling them to export goods globally for the first time despite being a landlocked country. Then there's the relationship between Vietnam and Cuba. During the 80s and 90s, when Vietnam faced harsh sanctions from the US and the entire United Nations, Cuba donated millions of vaccine doses that saved countless Vietnamese lives, including me. Without those vaccines, I might not be here today. Vietnam is forever grateful for what Cuba did, and today, Vietnam sends thousands of tons of rice to Cuba every year, totally free of charge. We also dispatch our top agriculture experts to help the improve rice cultivation. These are just a few examples of the countless acts of solidarity between Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba. There is a better path for nations to make in dealing with each other, and I think Vietnam has a lot to offer in providing such alternative paths. Since 1998, Vietnam has been consistently had a foreign policy that we call the Four No's policy. This policy includes the following 4 rules. Number 1, no military alliance with any other nation. Number 2, no allying with one country against another country. Number 3, no foreign military bases on our territory. And number 4, no use of violence or threats of violence in international diplomacy. If you would like to learn more about this policy, I have a whole video on it, link in the description. But the most important thing to understand is that Vietnam is trying its best to build friendly terms with the world, to use mutual beneficial negotiations to engage with the world, and will always choose peace while keeping our nation independent and self-determined. What I've shared with you is proof that nations can share bonds of genuine friendship, bonds rooted principles of humanism, love, and mutual aid. Vietnam has proved that even a small war-torn country can still survive and thrive without falling into a protection racket. We Vietnamese communists all share a dream of a future that is classless, stateless, and borderless. As a people, we are deeply committed to this vision, and we invite you to share us in that vision. Now it's time for my European friends to step out of the shadow of the US, choose your own path, and decide your own future. Take control of your own nations and build true friendship with the rest of the world. Good luck to you all. Vietnam will always welcome those who seek win-win partnership for a better future for humanity. Because after all, we share only one Earth, and its survival depends on us. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Bye!